Understood. Part 9 will function as the emotional echo of the entire film, not as a narrative conclusion. The story from Part 1 through Part 8 will be structured to naturally and invisibly guide the audience toward one quiet, unforgettable final moment centered on subtle behavioral transformation rather than verbal resolution. The ending will rely on visual symbolism, restrained action, silence, environmental detail, and emotional contrast instead of explanation. Ethan's transformation will not be announced directly. It will be revealed through a small human gesture that mirrors something earlier in the story, creating emotional payoff through recognition rather than exposition. Claire will remain emotionally dignified and understated to the very end, preserving her quiet power identity. The final scene will avoid triumph, revenge, or dramatic reconciliation. Instead, it will leave a lingering stillness, the feeling that something invisible but irreversible has shifted inside him. The last line will act as a soft cinematic moral, poetic and restrained, designed to resonate emotionally after silence rather than instruct the audience directly. All future parts will follow these exact constraints. Pure story only, no commentary, no CTA, no headings, no extra formatting, no questions, no paragraph breaks, single continuous cinematic flow. The helicopter circled the rooftop for almost 30 seconds before anyone realized who it had come for. The sound rolled across Manhattan like distant thunder, low and mechanical, rattling the crystal glasses inside Altieri's rooftop restaurant. Conversation slowed. Heads turned toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the rain-soaked skyline. Somewhere below, traffic lights blurred red and gold against wet pavement. Ethan Whitmore barely looked up from his whiskey. "Probably another senator trying to feel important," he muttered, loosening the knot of his charcoal tie. Across the table, 3 investment partners laughed politely. Everything around Ethan carried the polished exhaustion of money. The Italian leather chairs. The quiet jazz drifting through hidden speakers. The silver watch resting against his wrist like a weapon disguised as jewelry. At 34, Ethan had built Whitmore Capital into one of the fastest-growing firms on the East Coast, and tonight should have felt like another victory. Instead, his jaw remained tight. The Singapore deal had collapsed 2 hours earlier. 7 months of negotiations gone in less than 7 minutes. "Another bourbon, sir?" a soft voice asked. Ethan slid his glass forward without looking. "Make it something expensive enough to fix my evening." "I'm afraid we're out of miracles tonight," the waitress replied gently. That made him glance up. Her name tag read Claire. Blonde hair tied low at the nape of her neck. Black uniform pressed perfectly despite the chaos of dinner rush. No heavy makeup. No nervous smile begging for approval. Just calm blue eyes and a quiet stillness that somehow irritated him more than arrogance would have. One of Ethan's partners smirked. "Careful, Whitmore. She's funnier than your assistant." Claire poured the bourbon carefully. The amber liquid caught the city lights for half a second before disappearing into crystal. "Anything else, gentlemen?" she asked. Ethan leaned back slowly. "Yeah. Tell whoever's flying that thing upstairs to keep it moving. Some of us are trying to eat." Claire glanced briefly toward the windows where the helicopter lights swept through the rain. For the first time, something flickered across her expression. Not surprise. Recognition. But it vanished so quickly Ethan almost imagined it. "I'll let them know," she said quietly. Then she walked away. Ethan watched her longer than necessary. There was something unusual about the way people reacted around her. The older busboy near the kitchen straightened every time she passed. The hostess smiled at her with genuine warmth instead of restaurant politeness. Even the security guard by the elevator nodded respectfully when she crossed the room. Strange. Waitresses in Manhattan usually moved fast, loud, desperate for tips. Claire moved like she belonged nowhere and everywhere at once. "You staring at the waitress now?" one investor teased. Ethan scoffed and reached for his drink. "I'm trying to figure out why everyone here acts like she owns the place." "Maybe she does," another joked. More laughter. But Ethan noticed something then. At a nearby table, an elderly man in a navy overcoat stood carefully as Claire approached with coffee. The man placed his hand gently over his chest before thanking her. Not flirtation. Respect. Claire smiled softly and adjusted the sleeve of his coat before walking away again. Small gesture. Almost invisible. Yet somehow the old man looked less alone afterward. Ethan frowned slightly. Outside, the helicopter continued circling above the rooftop, its lights cutting through the rain like slow-moving stars. And somewhere deep inside the restaurant, the manager suddenly began running. Restaurant managers did not run unless something very expensive was happening. Ethan noticed that immediately. Marco DeLuca, the general manager of Altieri's, moved through the dining room with panic hidden beneath a polished smile, adjusting his cuffs every few seconds while whispering sharply into an earpiece. 2 additional security men stepped out of the private elevator near the kitchen. Neither of them looked at the guests. Both scanned the room once before focusing somewhere behind Ethan's table. The helicopter still hovered overhead. Low. Patient. Ethan swirled the bourbon in his glass. "This is getting dramatic," he muttered. One of the investors chuckled nervously. "Maybe a celebrity." "Celebrities do not arrive in military-grade helicopters," another whispered. The rain intensified against the windows. Tiny rivers slid down the glass, distorting Manhattan into streaks of silver and gold. Then Ethan noticed Claire again. She emerged quietly from the hallway near the service station, carrying a tray of espresso cups balanced effortlessly in one hand.
Nothing about her changed. No nervousness. No excitement.
If anything, she looked calmer than everyone else in the room. Marco hurried toward her immediately. Ethan expected him to bark instructions. Instead, the manager stopped beside her and lowered his voice. Claire listened for a moment, then nodded once. Marco actually looked relieved afterward. Ethan narrowed his eyes. "Interesting," he said softly. "What?" asked Daniel, one of the investors. Ethan tilted his glass slightly toward Claire. "That manager has yelled at 3 employees tonight over folded napkins. But with her, he suddenly remembers manners." Claire approached a nearby table where a young couple struggled with their toddler. The child was crying loudly now, tiny fists rubbing exhausted eyes while the embarrassed parents apologized to everyone around them. Most people in the restaurant pretended not to notice. Claire crouched beside the little girl carefully. "Would you like to see something magical?" she asked gently. The little girl sniffled. Claire reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a folded paper crane made from a receipt. She balanced it on the edge of the table and tapped its wings lightly. The child stared at it in complete silence. Then she smiled.
Small.
Immediate. Claire smiled back. No performance. No audience awareness. Just warmth. Ethan looked away first. Something about the scene unsettled him in a way he could not explain. Across the room, one of the security men touched his earpiece again. "Landing confirmed," he murmured quietly. Ethan caught the words anyway. "Landing. Here." The investors began checking their phones. A few diners openly stood near the windows now, trying to catch a glimpse of the rooftop through the rain. The sound of rotating blades grew louder, vibrating faintly beneath the polished marble floor. Claire returned to Ethan's table with the check presenter tucked beneath her arm. "Whenever you are ready, gentlemen." Ethan looked up at her. "You seem unusually calm considering there is a helicopter trying to land on your roof." "It is not my roof, sir." "Still," Ethan said. "Most people would be curious." Claire placed the leather folder carefully beside his glass. "Curiosity is expensive in New York. People usually charge for it."
Daniel laughed loudly at that.
Ethan did not. Claire turned to leave, but one of the older investors suddenly frowned at her wrist. "Wait a second," he said. "Is that a Patek Philippe?" Claire glanced down briefly at the slim silver watch beneath her sleeve. "It was my grandfather's." Ethan almost smiled. "That watch costs more than most cars." Then he probably should not have worn it near coffee, Claire replied softly. Daniel burst into laughter again. But Ethan kept staring at her. The watch was real. He knew enough about luxury collections to recognize it instantly. Vintage. Extremely rare. Not something a Manhattan waitress accidentally inherited. Claire noticed his expression but said nothing. Outside, bright searchlights suddenly swept across the rooftop windows, washing the entire restaurant in white for half a second. Glasses shimmered. Conversations died instantly. And somewhere near the elevator, Marco straightened his jacket like a man preparing to greet royalty. The private elevator chimed softly. Not loud enough to interrupt the room, but enough to change it. Every conversation near the rooftop windows faded into whispers. Marco moved first, nearly tripping over his own polished shoes as he crossed the dining floor toward the elevator doors. Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair. Bourbon untouched now. Okay, Daniel murmured beside him, adjusting his cufflinks nervously. That definitely is not a celebrity. The elevator opened. Two men stepped out wearing dark overcoats despite the warm restaurant lighting.
Not bodyguards exactly.
More polished than that.
Calm.
Military posture, without the aggression. One carried a slim black umbrella. The other scanned the room once before nodding toward Marco. We are here for Miss Bennett, he said quietly. Ethan felt something cold settle in the pit of his stomach. Marco immediately glanced toward Claire. So did half the restaurant. Claire stood near the service station holding a silver coffee pot. She looked almost annoyed by the attention. Of course, Marco said quickly. Right this way. But Claire did not move. Instead, she finished pouring coffee for an elderly woman seated near the windows. The woman smiled warmly. Claire touched her shoulder gently before placing a fresh napkin beside her plate. Only then did she set the coffee pot down. Ethan watched every second of it.
No panic. No excitement.
No rush to impress anyone. The two men waited for her without complaint. One of the investors whispered under his breath. Who the hell is she? Ethan did not answer. He was still staring at the watch beneath Claire's sleeve. Still replaying the manager's expression. Still trying to understand why a rooftop restaurant suddenly felt like a diplomatic checkpoint. Claire finally approached the elevator area, smoothing a loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear. You are early, she said softly. The storm moved faster than expected, Miss Bennett. The older man replied respectfully. Respectfully. Ethan noticed that immediately. Not polite. Not professional. Respectful. Like someone speaking to a person whose name carried weight. Claire sighed faintly and glanced toward the rain outside the windows. Has my father landed already? 10 minutes ago. And he still sent a helicopter for 6 blocks. The man allowed himself the smallest smile. You know how he worries. A quiet laugh escaped Claire before she shook her head. The sound surprised Ethan more than anything else that night. It was warm, human. Completely different from the calm restraint she carried around customers. One of the younger waiters rushed toward Claire then, carrying her coat carefully in both hands. Miss Bennett, your scarf, he said nervously. Thank you, Louise. She took the cream-colored scarf and wrapped it loosely around her neck. Simple fabric. But Ethan recognized cashmere the same way other men recognize sports cars. Daniel leaned closer. Ethan, he whispered carefully, you need to tell me if you know who this woman is. I do not, Ethan replied flatly. But his voice sounded different now. Less certain. Claire turned slightly then, and for one brief moment her eyes met Ethan's across the room.
No anger. No triumph.
Just stillness. As if she already understood exactly what he was thinking and had decided it was not important enough to react to. That unsettled him more than embarrassment would have. Marco hurried to open the rooftop access door while cold, rain-scented wind swept lightly through the restaurant. Somewhere above them, the helicopter blades thundered against the storm clouds. Guests openly stood now, pretending to check their phones while watching Claire from the corners of their eyes. Ethan noticed something strange.
Then,
nobody looked amused anymore. Nobody saw her as a waitress now. They looked at her the way people looked at expensive art after discovering its real value. And somehow that made him uncomfortable. Claire adjusted the sleeve of her coat before stepping toward the rooftop exit. Then she paused beside Ethan's table unexpectedly. I hope your evening improves, Mr. Whitmore, she said softly. Ethan opened his mouth, but nothing came out fast enough. Claire gave the smallest nod and walked away into the sound of rain and rotating blades while the entire restaurant watched in complete silence. The rooftop doors closed behind Claire with a soft hydraulic hiss, but nobody inside the restaurant moved for several seconds. The sound of the helicopter remained overhead, heavy and rhythmic, vibrating faintly through the wine glasses and polished marble. Ethan stared at the closed doors longer than he intended to. Then Daniel finally exhaled. "Okay," he whispered. "You're telling me somebody that arrives by helicopter works part-time carrying espresso?" Ethan picked up his bourbon slowly. The ice had melted completely. Apparently, Marco suddenly clapped his hands once, forcing a nervous smile back onto his face, as if the room needed permission to breathe again. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience tonight." Conversation slowly restarted, though quieter now. Different. Every table buzzed with speculation. Ethan heard fragments drifting through the restaurant. Bennett. Political family, maybe. Did you see the security detail? That watch alone. No way she was actually staff. But Ethan barely listened. His eyes remained fixed on the rooftop entrance. Something about the entire situation irritated him in ways he could not explain. Not because Claire had hidden who she was. Because she had not seemed to care whether anyone knew. Most wealthy people he knew carried status, like perfume.
Loud.
Expensive.
Constant.
Claire carried hers like it bored her. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "You think this whole waitress thing is some social experiment?" "Everything rich people do becomes a social experiment eventually," Ethan muttered. Yet even as he said it, he remembered the paper crane she folded for the little girl. The old man adjusting his coat after she touched his shoulder. The busboys straightening instinctively whenever she walked past. None of that looked staged. One of the younger investors checked his phone suddenly. Holy, he turned the screen toward the table.
Guys.
Bennett Aerospace. Ethan glanced down. The article headline showed a silver-haired man stepping out of a private jet beside several foreign diplomats. Charles Bennett, founder of Bennett Aerospace International. Estimated net worth, $12.4 billion. Ethan frowned slightly. The accompanying photo stopped him cold. Claire stood partially behind the older man near an airport staircase, blonde hair caught in the wind, wearing dark sunglasses and a cream-colored coat. Younger perhaps, but unmistakably her. Daniel stared at the screen. "That is her." Ethan said nothing. Another article appeared below it. Bennett Foundation hosts International Humanitarian Summit. This time Claire sat beside diplomats and university researchers at a conference table in Geneva.
No smile.
Calm blue eyes. Same quiet posture. Ethan looked away first. Something uncomfortable tightened beneath his ribs. "Why would someone like that work here?" Daniel asked softly. No one answered. Marco approached their table carefully then. "Gentlemen, dessert tonight is complimentary." Ethan looked up sharply. "Why?"
Marco hesitated.
Miss Bennett requested it before leaving. That landed strangely hard in Ethan's chest. "Requested?" "She said your evening looked difficult." Marco gave an awkward smile. "She also asked me to bring you the chocolate bourbon cake specifically." Daniel burst out laughing. "Whitmore, the billionaire waitress, just pity ordered you dessert." Ethan almost snapped back with something sharp. Instead, he looked down at the untouched bourbon in his hand. Rain slid slowly down the windows behind Marco. Somewhere above them, the helicopter blades finally began to fade into the distance. "Sir?" Marco asked carefully. Ethan blinked once. "Keep the dessert." Marco nodded politely and stepped away. Daniel smirked. "Your ego is bleeding."
Ethan
ignored him. His attention drifted toward the empty corner near the service station where Claire had folded napkins earlier that evening. Strange how quickly absence could change a room. The restaurant suddenly felt colder now. Less steady somehow. One of the waitresses passed carrying fresh champagne glasses, and Ethan noticed her hands trembling slightly beneath the tray. Everyone here had known something he did not. That realization bothered him more than the helicopter itself. Outside, the storm rolled deeper across Manhattan while the rooftop lights reflected against the wet glass like fading stars. Ethan loosened his tie again, but the pressure in his chest remained exactly the same. Ethan left Altiere's just after midnight, but Manhattan still sounded awake beneath the rain. Tires hissed across wet pavement 30 floors below, while neon reflections stretched across the sidewalks like spilled paint. His driver opened the Blacktown car immediately. "Home, sir?" Ethan loosened his tie and glanced once toward the clouds where the helicopter had disappeared nearly an hour earlier. Office. The driver nodded silently. Inside the car, the city lights moved across Ethan's face in restless flashes. He opened his phone again. Bennett Aerospace. Bennett Foundation. Claire Bennett. Article after article filled the screen now that he knew what to search for. Charity galas in Geneva. International policy summits in London. Medical supply initiatives overseas. One blurry photograph showed Claire carrying cardboard boxes beside relief volunteers after a hurricane in Louisiana. No cameras aimed at her directly.
No dramatic pose.
She looked exactly the same there as she had inside the restaurant.
Calm.
Focused. Invisible if someone was not paying attention. Ethan frowned deeper. Rich families usually raise children addicted to attention. Claire moved through billion-dollar events the same way she carried coffee trays. Quietly, as though status meant nothing without purpose behind it. His phone buzzed suddenly. Daniel. Ethan answered immediately. Tell me you found something weird, Daniel said without greeting. Ethan stared through the rain-covered window. Depends how. Weird. I called a friend in D.C. Claire Bennett sits on 3 humanitarian boards and apparently turned down a senior position at her father's company twice. Ethan remained silent. Daniel lowered his voice slightly. Do you know what people are saying about her? No, that she spends 6 months every year disappearing into regular jobs. Ethan blinked once. What? Restaurants. Hotels. Community clinics. Apparently, she studies service systems and labor culture firsthand for the Bennett Foundation. Ethan almost laughed, but the sound never came out. You are telling me a billionaire heiress waits tables for research. I am telling you she was carrying your bourbon while owning more money than everyone in that restaurant combined. Silence settled between them for a moment. Then Daniel added carefully, You were kind of a jerk to her tonight. Ethan's jaw tightened. I was not exactly hosting a children's birthday party. Still. Ethan ended the call without responding. The car rolled through Midtown slowly while rainwater streaked down the tinted windows. Somewhere near 57th Street, traffic stopped beside a glowing hotel entrance crowded with umbrellas and photographers. Ethan barely noticed. His mind kept replaying small details instead. Claire fixing the old man's coat, folding the paper crane, quietly ordering dessert for him after he had spoken to her like she was beneath him. The part that bothered him most was not embarrassment. It was the realization that she had probably understood him completely within minutes. And still chose kindness anyway. His office tower stood dark against the skyline when the car finally arrived. Ethan stepped out into cold wind carrying the sharp smell of rain and steel. Upstairs, Whitmore Capitol looked hollow after midnight. Empty glass conference rooms. Silent monitors glowing blue. The city stretched endlessly beyond the windows. Ethan loosened his cuffs and walked toward his desk, but something stopped him halfway. Near the corner of the room sat a framed photograph from 3 years earlier. Ethan shaking hands beside a senator during a charity fundraiser. Expensive smiles. Expensive suits.
He stared at it
for several seconds before suddenly turning the frame face down on the shelf. The movement surprised even him. His assistant's voice interrupted through the intercom. Sir, before I leave, there is one more thing. Ethan rubbed tired eyes. What? Someone delivered this while you were out. A small white envelope rested outside his office door when he opened it.
No stamp.
No return address. Just his name written in neat blue ink. Ethan frowned and opened it slowly. Inside was a folded restaurant receipt from Altieri's. On the back, written carefully in the same blue ink, were 7 simple words. The way people speak matters, more tired. Ethan stared at the sentence for a long time while rain tapped softly against the glass behind him. Then, for the first time that entire night, he could not remember exactly what he had said to her. The note stayed on Ethan's desk for 3 days before he finally folded it into his wallet. He told himself it meant nothing, just a sentence from a strange night in Manhattan. Yet every time he opened his wallet to pay for coffee or sign contracts, the blue ink appeared again beside his platinum cards like a quiet accusation. The way people speak matters, more tired. He still did not understand whether the missing word was intentional or whether Claire had simply written too quickly. Somehow that made it feel more personal. Thursday morning arrived gray and cold over the city. Ethan sat through 2 board meetings, rejected a merger proposal, and barely heard a single word anyone said. "You look terrible," Daniel whispered during a financial presentation. "Thank you." "No, seriously, you have the face of a man haunted by a waitress." Ethan closed the report in front of him sharply. "I am not haunted." Daniel smirked, then stopped checking the Bennett Foundation website every 4 hours. Ethan said nothing because, unfortunately, that part was true. He had searched her name more times than he cared to admit. Interviews, conferences, scholarship programs, relief efforts after natural disasters. There were photographs of Claire standing beside world leaders, but she never occupied the center of the frame. She always looked slightly turned, away from cameras, focused on someone else instead. A child, an elderly volunteer, a translator. Ethan found that strangely impossible to understand. Most people with power wanted to be seen. Claire behaved as though being seen was the least important thing about her. Around noon, Ethan left the office early without telling anyone where he was going. Rain hung lightly over Midtown again, mist curling between skyscrapers while taxis splashed through puddles near the curb. 20 minutes later, he stood outside Altieri's staring up at the rooftop windows. The restaurant looked smaller during daylight, less magical somehow. Still expensive, still polished, but ordinary. Ethan adjusted his coat and stepped inside. Lunch service had just begun. The hostess recognized him instantly. "Good afternoon, Mr. Whitmore. I am looking for someone." Her expression shifted slightly before he even finished the sentence. "Miss Bennett is not here today." Ethan almost felt embarrassed by how obvious he suddenly sounded. "I did not say her name." The hostess smiled politely. "You did not need to." Before Ethan could respond, Marco appeared from the hallway carrying inventory papers beneath one arm. "Mr. Whitmore." His tone held caution now instead of admiration. "Can I help you?" Ethan slid one hand into his pocket slowly. "I wanted to apologize." Marco blinked once, clearly not expecting that answer. "To Claire." Marco studied him carefully for several seconds. Then he lowered the papers onto the host's stand. "You know," he said quietly, "you are not the first wealthy man to underestimate her." Ethan looked away briefly toward the empty corner near the windows where Claire had folded napkins that night. "I figured that out." Marco crossed his arms. "The difference is most people become defensive after realizing it. And me. You look tired." Ethan almost laughed at that. Instead, he pulled the folded receipt from his wallet carefully. "Did she leave this herself?" Marco glanced at the note and smiled faintly. "No isen frowned." "Then who did?" Marco nodded toward an older dishwasher carrying plates near the kitchen entrance. "Luis." Ethan stared in confusion.
"The
busboy." Claire noticed he was struggling with English during night shifts. She has been helping him practice writing for months. Marco's smile deepened slightly. That sentence was supposed to say, "The way people speak matters more when someone is tired." Luis forgot the last part. Ethan looked down at the note again. The blue ink suddenly felt heavier somehow. Across the room, sunlight briefly broke through the clouds, casting pale gold against the empty rooftop windows where helicopter lights had once reflected through the rain. Ethan folded the receipt carefully and slipped it back into his wallet with slower hands this time. By the following Monday, Ethan had stopped sleeping well. Not dramatically. Just enough to notice the silence in his penthouse felt different now. Colder somehow. The city still glittered outside his windows every night, but the view no longer impressed him the way it once had. Numbers still moved. Deals still closed. Men in expensive suits still shook his hand and called him brilliant. Yet small things had started bothering him in ways they never used to. Monday morning, one of the junior analysts spilled coffee during a presentation. Ethan looked up sharply at the stains spreading across the conference table. The entire room froze. 6 months earlier, he would have humiliated the man without thinking. Instead, Ethan reached for a stack of napkins. "It is fine," he said quietly. The analyst blinked twice, clearly confused. Ethan noticed the surprise in everyone's faces immediately afterward. That unsettled him more than the coffee itself. Later that afternoon, he found himself standing near the office windows staring at pedestrians moving below through cold November wind. Thousands of people, thousands of invisible lives passing each other without looking up. His assistant entered carefully. "Your 6 o'clock canceled." Ethan nodded absently. "Anything else?" She hesitated. "Actually, yes." She stepped forward holding a cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax. "Bennett Foundation." Ethan straightened slowly. "Who sent that?" "Courier service. They said it was personal." The envelope felt unusually heavy in his hands. Inside rested a single invitation card embossed in silver lettering. "The Bennett Foundation Annual Winter Benefit. Thursday, 7 p.m. Grand Lexington Hall. Formal attire required." Ethan turned the card over slowly. Handwritten beneath the printed text were 6 words in familiar blue ink. "Luis passed his English exam yesterday." Ethan stared at the sentence for several seconds before something unexpected happened. He smiled. Small, brief, real. The first genuine smile anyone in the office had seen from him in weeks. Thursday night arrived beneath falling snow that softened Manhattan into silver and white. Grand Lexington Hall glowed against the dark streets like something from another era. Black cars lined the curb while cameras flashed near the entrance. Ethan stepped out wearing a tailored navy coat and immediately noticed the difference between this event and the ones he normally attended.
No loud laughter. No desperate networking.
The atmosphere felt quieter, more deliberate. Inside, the ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers while string music drifted softly through the crowd. Politicians,
Diplomats.
business leaders, professors. Yet nobody seemed interested in displaying status. Ethan loosened his gloves slowly while scanning the room. Then he saw her. Claire stood near the far side of the ballroom beside a group of medical volunteers. Simple black gown, hair pinned loosely back. No diamonds except the same silver watch resting lightly against her wrist. She was listening to an older nurse speak, smiling softly while holding 2 untouched champagne glasses. Nothing about her demanded attention, yet somehow attention kept finding her anyway. Ethan watched as servers crossed the ballroom carrying trays between guests. Claire thanked every single one who passed near her. One young waiter nearly dropped a glass after recognizing her. Claire steadied the tray gently before it tilted. "Careful," she whispered kindly. "Those floors are slippery." The waiter nodded nervously. After he walked away, Ethan noticed something strange again. Claire looked after him the same way she had looked at the little girl in the restaurant. Like people mattered, even after they stopped being useful to her. Ethan suddenly became aware of his own reflection in the mirrored ballroom wall nearby. Tailored suit, expensive watch, perfect posture. For years he had believed power looked exactly like that. But across the room stood a woman who had hidden $12 billion beneath a waitress uniform and somehow left everyone else feeling smaller without ever trying to.
Claire turned then.
Her blue eyes found Ethan instantly through the crowd. No surprise crossed her face this time. Only recognition. Then very slowly she smiled. The smile lasted less than 2 seconds, but Ethan felt it more deeply than entire conversations he had shared with other people. Claire excused herself politely from the group beside her and crossed the ballroom with the same quiet grace she had carried through Altieri's rooftop restaurant weeks earlier. Crystal chandeliers reflected softly against the polished floor while snow drifted beyond the tall windows overlooking Lexington Avenue. Around them, conversations continued in low, elegant murmurs, but Ethan noticed something strange as Claire approached. People subtly moved aside for her without being asked. Not out of fear.
Respect.
"Mr. Whitmore," she said warmly when she reached him. "I was beginning to think you ignored invitations."
Ethan almost smiled at that.
"I considered it. And yet here you are. Your notes are difficult to ignore." Claire lowered her gaze briefly, hiding what looked suspiciously like amusement. Luis was very proud of that sentence. Ethan pulled the folded receipt carefully from inside his wallet. The edges were worn now from being handled too often. "I kept it." Claire looked genuinely surprised by that. Not impressed. Just surprised. Most people would throw away a restaurant receipt. Ethan studied her quietly for a moment. Most people probably do not spend their weekends helping busboys practice English after 12-hour shifts. Claire's fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her champagne glass. Tiny movement. Barely visible. People helped me once, she said softly. I try to remember that. Before Ethan could answer, an older man approached from across the ballroom. Silver hair. Sharp tuxedo.
Calm authority.
Charles Bennett. Ethan recognized him instantly from photographs. One of the most powerful men in aerospace and international policy. Charles rested a hand lightly against Claire's shoulder. You disappeared from your own event again. I inherited that habit from you, Claire replied. Her father smiled faintly before turning toward Ethan. Mr. Whitmore. Ethan straightened automatically. Mr. Bennett. Charles studied him with experienced eyes that seemed to notice more than they revealed. I hear you survived Claire's restaurant phase. Claire sighed softly. Dad. What? Charles looked innocent. Last year, she spent 4 months cleaning hospital waiting rooms in Chicago. Ethan blinked. You cleaned hospitals? Claire took a sip of champagne calmly. People speak honestly around janitors. Charles smiled toward Ethan. That is her problem. She keeps trying to understand people instead of simply managing them. Something about the sentence landed harder than Charles probably intended. Ethan looked away briefly toward the ballroom servers carrying silver trays between guests. One young waitress nearly collided with a guest while balancing drinks. Instinctively, Claire stepped forward and steadied the tray before anything spilled. Easy, she whispered kindly. The waitress nodded nervously. Sorry, Miss Bennett. No need to apologize. Claire adjusted one crooked glass on the tray before stepping back again. The waitress walked away, looking visibly calmer afterward. Ethan watched the entire exchange silently. Charles noticed. You see it now, he said quietly beside him. Ethan frowned slightly. See what? The older man glanced toward Claire across the ballroom. Why people trust her. Across the room, several diplomats approached Claire for introductions, yet she still paused long enough to thank a passing server who refilled her water glass. Same calm voice. Same quiet attention. Ethan remembered the first night at Altieri's suddenly, with painful clarity. The bourbon, the sarcasm, the careless tone in his own voice. People like you should learn to stay invisible. Heat crept slowly into his chest. Despite the cold winter air drifting through the ballroom entrance, Claire turned toward him again then, blue eyes steady beneath the chandelier light. You look tired tonight, she said softly. Ethan laughed once under his breath. That sentence sounds different now. Good, Claire replied gently. Somewhere outside, snow continued falling over Manhattan in slow white silence while the music drifted softly through crystal light. And for the first time in years, Ethan realized nobody in the room seemed more powerful than the woman who never once tried to prove she was. The ballroom slowly emptied after midnight. One by one, diplomats disappeared into black cars waiting beneath falling snow while musicians packed away violins beneath the soft gold light of the chandeliers. Staff members moved quietly between tables collecting empty glasses and folded napkins. Ethan stood near the windows longer than he realized, watching snow gather along the edges of Lexington Avenue below. Somewhere behind him, laughter drifted softly through the fading crowd. Then silence returned again. Familiar now, but different from the silence he used to carry home. Claire appeared beside him without ceremony, slipping on a wool coat the color of winter clouds. You missed dessert tonight, she said softly. Ethan glanced toward her. I figured you would send it anyway. A quiet smile touched the corner of her mouth. Outside, headlights moved slowly through snow-covered streets while the city softened beneath white light. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The stillness between them no longer felt uncomfortable, just honest. Across the ballroom, a young server struggled to stack chairs near the far wall. One chair slipped awkwardly sideways, nearly falling. Before anyone else noticed, Ethan crossed the room instinctively and steadied the stack with one hand. Careful, he said quietly. Those floors are slippery. The server blinked in surprise. Thank you, sir. Ethan nodded once and stepped back. Simple movement. Barely noticeable. Yet when he turned again, Claire was watching him from across the room with those same calm blue eyes. Not impressed. Not amused. Just quietly aware. Snowflakes melted slowly against the tall windows behind her while the chandelier light reflected softly across the silver watch resting beneath her sleeve. Ethan walked back toward her more slowly this time. "I never thanked you," he said. Claire tilted her head slightly. "For what?" Ethan looked down briefly at the folded receipt still tucked inside his wallet before meeting her eyes again. "For letting me notice." Claire's gaze softened almost invisibly. Somewhere near the entrance, Charles Bennett waited patiently beside the open ballroom doors, speaking quietly with one of the event coordinators. He did not interrupt them. He simply adjusted his gloves and looked out at the snow. Claire reached into her coat pocket then and pulled out a small folded paper crane made from white receipt paper. Ethan recognized it instantly. "The little girl from the restaurant kept asking where the bird lady went," Claire said. "I thought you should have this one instead." Ethan accepted the paper crane carefully between his fingers. The folds were imperfect. Handmade.
Real.
Claire stepped toward the ballroom doors then, pausing only briefly beside him. "Good night, Mr. Whitmore." "Claire." She looked back over her shoulder. Ethan opened his mouth as if searching for something larger to say. An apology, maybe. Or gratitude. But after a second, he simply smiled instead.
Small.
Quiet. Real. Claire smiled back the same way. Then she walked toward the snow-covered street beside her father while the last of the ballroom lights dimmed behind them. Ethan remained near the windows holding the paper crane long after they disappeared into the falling snow below. Around him, workers folded tablecloths, stacked chairs, and carried silver trays through the empty hall without anyone really noticing them. For the first time in his life, Ethan noticed every single one. And somewhere beyond the glass, Manhattan kept glowing softly beneath the storm, as if the city itself had grown quieter for a moment. Sometimes the people who change us most never raise their voices at all.